All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are excited to have you here for our fourth and almost final webinar series on understanding the post-midterm implications on business tax policy. I'm joined by three phenomenal panelists that I'll introduce you to afterwards, but I thought I'd just take a moment, since it's been a few weeks since we had our last panel, to level set, kind of explain the intention behind this webinar series, and then introduce Danielle Goonan to provide further perspective. First off, my name is Katie Bleedstra-Wannenberg. I'm a co-founder and principal at Public-Private Strategies, and I am proud to moderate today's panel as well. I think when we were constructing this with our fabulous partners at Niskanen, and Lee Gibson will join us at the end of the webinar to provide some closing thoughts and commentary on today's panel, but really about how can we have conversations as we are looking towards, post-midterm, as organizations, primarily within the philanthropic space, but also the advocacy space within the larger ecosystem of organizations that interact with lawmakers in their education pursuits. Really, what does it mean for us to be looking at what we anticipate will be divided government? And why is it important for us to talk about it now, as organizations are making their plans, are thinking about how they want to interact with both Congress from an education perspective, and think about also, I think, the large numbers of potentially new members of Congress that are coming here that are going to need to be educated on important aspects of our policy space. I think the other thing too is that we are interested in collaboration and dialogue, and as we have structured these 4 panels, we have really tried to bring together experts in this space to talk about it, but also make sure that through the conversations that we're having really good dialogue, and that people are thinking about things in a unique way, and that they are also pondering back to our panelists ways in which there could be opportunities to collaborate. I do want to remind folks that we are recording this session, and so please note that. At the top of the call, before some of you joined, I want to remind you that we will be able to field some questions in the chat. So as our conversation gets started, please feel free to use the chat function to ask your questions. I'll do my best as moderator to bring them into the conversation. But I also want to just ask people to be respectful. And I think that is key to how we all are trying to navigate the world, is with respect. And I think with a little compassion would do us all a little favor. So with that, I just want to thank our great partners at Niskanen. Like I said, Lee Gibson will join us at the end of the call to provide some perspective, but really the brainchild for these panels came from our great partners at Niskanen. So Lee and Sam Hammond, who I think might be on the phone, thank you so much. And then I just really want to thank Danielle Goonan with the Rockefeller Foundation, who is really, I think, thrown her heart and soul and her funding into really creating spaces for people to collaborate and talk in new ways. And so with that, I do want to actually turn it over to Danielle to provide some context and setup for the conversations. I will be brief in my intro of her, but as hopefully some of you have had the opportunity to meet Danielle, she's the managing director of the U.S. Equity and Economic Opportunity Initiative at the Rockefeller Foundation, has a pretty amazing and substantive background in this space, and deep passion for the work that she's doing at Rockefeller and has brought with her throughout her career. So Danielle, I'd love to turn it over to you to provide some setup at the beginning of the call.
Thank you so much. So first, thank you to PPS, Katie and her team, Michael, Maya, Brett, who's not on here, and obviously the folks at Niskanen, Lee, Sam, and the entire team there for all the work that went into the series. I apologize, today was Rockefeller's summer picnic, so I am somewhere in Manhattan at a table trying to manage Rockefeller leadership and showing up, as well as being present with all of you. So our hope in organizing this series overall was to leverage this point in time, right, where there is a potential for a new Congress, and how do we use that to provide space for cross-partisan conversations about policies that are critical for workers and their families. We wanted to ignite honest conversations, and our goal in igniting these conversations is that hopefully they lead to investments and organizing and programming that goes above and beyond the series, and reflects what is likely to be a divided government, whether we like that or not, right? This is, practicalities of the American politics, right? So while we are months away from midterm elections, and we can only speculate the results, I think planning ahead of time is always a good thing. But I do think, we don't necessarily need those results to come in to have a clear-eyed understanding of the state of our country at this moment in time. I would suggest to the folks on the phone that democracy is in crisis at the moment in the United States, and that our communities are struggling, and that everyday Americans are fighting for their lives while progress stalls on solutions at the federal level. And my goal, and I think everyone's goal on this call, is to not only bring relief for the American worker, but to create true pathways for stability and mobility, right? So over the series and today, the panelists and the moderators will bring and have brought a diversity of viewpoints on how to achieve a policy agenda that serves all Americans. And like I said at the kickoff event for this series, though we may disagree on the details, when it comes to economic security and justice, we are overwhelmingly aligned in our goal. And that goal is to structure America in such a way that all Americans can flourish. So moving forward, I do believe that pro-worker policies is our shared vision. And as we prepare for a new political reality, we need to be considering new strategies, new frameworks, and carving out new pathways with unlikely bedfellows to implement permanent solutions to our present economic crisis and our democratic crisis. So I really do implore us not to walk away from these conversations as just another webinar series, but hopefully to be able to build from here so we can all be prepared for our post-midterm reality. I do know that there is a lot weighing on all of us right now, and many of you who are on the line are much closer to the day-to-day fight than I am from my cushy seat at the Rockefeller Foundation. And I'm so thankful for each and every one of you for, quite frankly, slogging through the insanity at the moment and over the last few years. But I do fundamentally believe that tax policy is pro-democracy policy. And if we get this right, if we get economic security and justice right, we will have major impact on the broader work to save our democracy, build a healthier society, and ensure a future for our communities that is a vibrant future and something we could all be proud of. So on behalf of the foundation and my team, I want to thank all the moderators and all the panelists over the 4 events for their time and contributions. And of course, a special thank you for the folks who have attended, especially those who have attended all 4 of the events in the series. You're amazing. And may we inspire collective work, but also may we conspire together. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Danielle. I think with that sentiment, it's great for us to introduce our panelists and hop in. I do want to do no disservice to them, but I will keep my introductions of them brief so we can get into the meat of our conversation. We have Alex Stapp, who's the co-CEO of Institute for Progress. Alex Morshon, and if I said that wrong, Alex, please correct me when you introduce yourself, who is a federal policy analyst at the Tax Foundation, and Arnab Datta, who is the senior counsel at Employ America. I think we can all find people's bios, but welcome to the conversation. And to jump right in, I want to actually start with Alex, if you wouldn't mind, but the pandemic has really radically changed our understanding of how businesses operate. And I think the expectations of employers and employees, I come from a small business lens. So, that perspective for me is front and center, but I think generally from the business community with the lens of COVID, how do you really see where are the changes that are needed at this time and moment, but where is the momentum in those changes? And I think specifically, how are we thinking about the tax code in supporting continued growth of America's businesses? And of course, where my heart is, small businesses. But Alec, can you kick us off?
Definitely happy to do that. And thanks for the question. Thanks for having me today. I think that's a really important question. And I kind of think about it that small businesses and really the entire business sector in the United States has experienced opposite ends of volatility problem over the last 2+ years. During COVID, there was a massive drop in demand. What people weren't sure what kind of government interventions would happen, how high unemployment would rise, how much incomes would drop. And so there was a moment where business investment also collapsed, and people said, I'm going to, put the freeze on and maybe lay off workers, maybe not invest in expanded capacity and see how this goes. And of course, we have the opposite problem today with demand overheating. Businesses have more demand than they know what to do with. And now the question is like, okay, should I invest in expanded capacity? How long will this hot economy last? We could be entering a recession, depending on what the Federal Reserve does or where the economy goes. And so I think there are different tools to attack both of these problems. So we'll start on the overheating side. You want to increase labor supply at this moment. Unemployment is extremely low. Small and medium-sized businesses report that hiring is one of their biggest problems. If they want to expand capacity, finding workers for those jobs is very difficult. And so I think you can do two things. One, take another crack at the expanded refundable monthly child tax credit. That would support a lot of different workers in the labor market who maybe need extra help with childcare and need that money before they themselves re-enter the labor market. It was hugely effective at just cutting child poverty during the crisis. And unfortunately, Congress has not yet extended those expanded child tax credit benefits, and them being refundable, of course, was extremely important as well. Another tax credit that could help with the labor supply issue is expanding and reforming the earned income tax credit. It's really a pittance right now for single earners without dependents. And so expanding that tax credit significantly for individuals without dependents could increase labor supply in that segment of the labor market. And then lastly, just to address the other problem of income across the economy is very volatile across the business cycle, and small businesses, like all businesses, are forward looking, and they're saying like, should I invest in expanded capacity for the long run? And I think there you need solutions like automatic stabilizers, which are both on the tax and spending side, so that businesses are more confident that, okay, if I make an investment that's going to take 5 to 10 years to pay off in terms of expanding capacity, what are the odds we enter a recession? Will this investment pay off? And so I think something like the Claudia Sahm rule that changes unemployment insurance benefits given changes in the unemployment rate, those kind of things, along with, of course, monetary policy expectations, are a way of almost thinking of it as like income insurance that can then drive investment by businesses and growth by businesses.
Thank you, Alec. Alex, can I turn to you just as a top of like, what are you think, given where we're at, trying to get out of this pandemic situation, where do you think the tax policy opportunities exist to ensure that we are, I think, investing and supporting business growth in the country?
Yeah, so I think the place to start for me, there are a lot of different types of small businesses. There are a lot of things that sort of come to mind when people talk about small business. In some ways, you think about the mom and pop shop that is, in downtown, has maybe a couple employees and is sort of content to be that. It's not looking to grow. It's not looking to sort of dramatically expand and turn into a chain or something. It's just maintaining its operations and maybe adding a few more features. But we also have things like startups who, in many cases, ideally don't stay a small business, they expand and grow. And so I think startups are where, I think in a bigger sense, where a lot of macro scale growth can start, at least, is with startups disrupting new technologies with research and development. And so research and development is a big issue for in the tax world right now, because at the end of last year, the companies are no longer able to deduct the cost of investment in R&D immediately. They have to spread those deductions out over the course of 5 years. And this creates a penalty for investment in R&D, because those deductions in the future are going to be worth less than deductions today. Obviously that creates a disincentive to invest in R&D, and that translates over to a lot of, that means lower investment in R&D, that means slower technological improvement in the long run. Additionally, we do have a program as well, the R&D tax credit, that is supposed to incentivize R&D investment as well. So, maybe that helps offset some of the cost of the penalty, but the R&D tax credit is quite complicated and is a more difficult program for small businesses to access than just simply being able to immediately write off R&D expenses. And so legislatively, I think that bringing back the ability to fully deduct R&D is probably the sort of most immediately pressing issue on the sort of growing business perspective, just because it's already expired. And then thinking about investment more broadly, there are two provisions at play for more investment in, say, equipment, where one is 100% bonus depreciation, which allows companies to write off 100% of the cost of their equipment. And there's also, for small businesses, Section 179, which just allows a first baseline of 1 million in asset purchases of various kinds. And in some ways, I know this is a sort of a very Niskanen Center sort of would probably be very friendly to this framing, but in some ways, bonus depreciation is phasing out at the end of starting to phase out at the beginning of next year. This is the last year where we have it full. And in some ways, it phasing out creates a tax cliff for a growing business, where they'll still be able to write off 100% of the first sort of 1 million investment they make, but they'll start receiving a tax penalty as they try to further expand their operations. So that is also another concern when we think about growing, growing businesses. I think I might have gone a little bit over.
So my Alec and my Alex, I think Arnab set up the complexity of where the challenges lay. Whereas I appreciate that, because I think both with Alec, what you were talking about, and with Alex, like, here is the challenge, is that the business community is incredibly diverse. There is this issue of both employers and employees. I think Alex talking about like the size of businesses. So and I appreciate that you acknowledge the fact that there are small businesses who are proud to be small businesses, and this is what they want to achieve. And then in the mix of that is we have a startup environment where, potentially in the next decade, you could see a business going from 5 to 5,000. And then Alec really talking about the mechanisms in which employees can be find benefit within the tax code that ultimately helps them work. So Arnab, I leave it to you to try to pull it all together with some thoughts, maybe some feedback on the complexities that we face when we talk about tax policy in the business community.
Yeah, definitely. And also, thank you for having me. I think Alec just stole a lot of the stuff I was going to say. So thanks so much, Alec.
You're welcome.
I think it's absolutely right. I think the macro kind of context that we want to think about this for employees, for workers, and for businesses is, how can we just bring a bit more stability into our economy? I think if you look over the past couple of decades, it's really a story of volatility in a lot of ways. In some ways, it's volatility that might be confined to certain sectors, but very still impactful. And until really the end of until pre-COVID, it was quite a slow employment recovery, and we're obviously not experiencing that now. We have a different period. So I feel like the moment calls for us to, because there is this, I think, incipient bipartisan consensus about needing to fix some of this stuff long term. I hope a lot of the focus would really go into what type of structures, policies are we setting over the long term to build that type of future. And I think I'm more of a skeptic of how tax policy can really be leveraged to do a lot of that. I think one thing we should be thinking about is there is this consensus around certain kinds of spending, particularly on science and tech and innovation and American competitiveness. So I think bridging those two things together and finding a way that the spending and investment that the federal government doing can also feed into some of the certainty you get with tax policy. You know, it's that old adage that it's a lot harder to change tax policy once you've done it, that, you know, pros work the tax code. I think we could try to find a way to just stabilize and create more of a positive investment outlook, regardless of whatever volatility we're seeing in kind of the broader macroeconomic outlook.
Yeah. Quick, I think, a follow-up. I mean, I think, you know, the challenge is that we are not, to your point, like we are fairly guaranteed that we will have divided government. And I think that the challenge becomes, you know, the popularity of certain tax policy. I think we can find commonality between Republicans and Democrats. I think, you know, frankly, some of the credits that Alex talked about, I think are broadly have support. I think the challenge becomes, to your point, and maybe if you can, if you want to provide a quick response to this, and then Alex, and then Alec will go to you, is how do we find more consensus in some of those other policies that could provide stability, you know, to businesses, both small, medium, and large, with Republicans and Democrats? Like, how do we get there? Because I think in some cases, what we're really seeing is, you know, we're chipping around the edges, but we're not actually, to your point, I think you articulated it quite nicely, is structure of policies to provide that stability. Do you have any initial thoughts on that?
You know, I think divided government will present that opportunity somewhat naturally. I think one place particularly that I'm really thinking about it is housing policy. We have a real mishmash of housing programs. Obviously, one of the biggest that's in the tax code is the low-income housing tax credit. That is a great example of a program that works well. Like it does some really good things, but it's also got some pretty important design problems that create some like rent-seeking type challenges over time. I think that's like a great example of, there are a lot of Republicans who see housing affordability as a big problem. There are a lot of Democrats who do. You're limited in what you're going to be able to do. It's not going to be universal vouchers. Like Democrats would have to give up that type of a goal. But if they kind of roll their sleeves up and say, I want to work on fixing the low-income housing tax credit program and expanding it so that we can actually address this issue of housing affordability and getting more supply online, I think that's kind of an example of a place where you can be pretty targeted, but also have some impact.
Good. And I think what I'm hearing is we're going to have to meet in the middle on some of this stuff. We're going to have to compromise. Alex, what are your thoughts? I know the things that you mentioned about the R&D tax credit and investment tax credits are genuinely do have some bipartisanship. Do you think, in broadly, are there other things, Alex, that you would hope that maybe Republicans and Democrats could come to agreement on, or how would you move them there?
Yeah, so I think on R&D, I think there is a lot of bipartisan agreement already. I think there are bipartisan bills on both simplifying the R&D credit and making it more accessible for small businesses, and a bill to return to just full expensing for R&D investment. I think both of those bills have bipartisan support. I think it's just sort of a question of I think both McConnell and Schumer both see as like the standoff of a reconciliation, I think, is like impeding that. I think like some of the Build Back Better did have temporarily restoring R&D expensing, and so I think that's part of the reason why there's some skepticism of putting it off independently, because I think some people want to do it in BBB. So I think in some ways, I think a divided government would make that easier, because the question of doing like a Democrat alone bill would be sort of confirmed to be, would be unworkable. So there wouldn't be any other option. But on the other hand, the unfortunate thing, and this goes to Arnab's point about stability, is that often the worry with these is that they're going to get turned into extenders, which are, you know, tax provisions that are designed for budget reason, for sort of paper budget reasons to expire. That's why the R&D amortization, which is spreading the deductions out, was created in the first place, was to make TCJA look like wouldn't raise the deficit by as much. And instead of making these policies, which are never supposed to actually expire permanent, they just keep getting renewed every year for 1 year. The R&D tax credit, I think, was renewed 15 times or something before it was made permanent in like 2015. So I think that's a concern with sort of that like it might end up getting done on a bipartisan basis like that, which is not ideal. Ideally, we would have a clean, stable permanence.
Yeah, I mean, that I know it's not something that we necessarily we're touching on it now, but I do think that is the other challenge with tax policy, is really that it's the stability of it all, regardless of if we're talking about business, healthcare, labor, family. Like it's the need for there to be stability in it. And I think, unfortunately, because you use the word, so I'll use it, it's very gimmicky and how we do this. And I think that's a challenge. I think, Alec, turning to you, you talked about the child tax credit and EITC, which I think is, from the perspective of the employee, again, how do you envision both policies that used to be wildly popular with Republicans and Democrats? How do you see efforts to bring that back more to, I would just use the center, in the sense of being more bipartisan? I think to the point that we can see the data primarily with the child tax credit, having such a really overwhelmingly positive impact. But how do you see that working in the next Congress?
Yeah, I think it's overwhelmingly likely we're going to have divided government, and so any policy issue you want to advance in that environment needs to speak to both sides in that scenario. And I'll actually use a different word than bipartisan, or even people might say nonpartisan. A term we prefer internally at the Institute for Progress is cross-partisan. And I think there's an important distinction. We think of nonpartisan as trying to be apolitical or just kind of standoffish from the controversial politics of the day. Bipartisan is often thought of as like a messy middle or a compromise, or getting half a loaf. And so everyone kind of like walks away dissatisfied and isn't fully enthusiastic about the policy that ends up getting implemented. Cross-partisanship, by contrast, we think of as each side supporting the same policy, but for different reasons. And I think that leads to more durable policy change. As a think tank, you should think about how you're messaging to each side on cross-partisan issues. So to just quickly, the example of the child tax credit, I think that is a policy that in theory could be cross-partisan depending on how it's messaged from different constituents and groups in DC. Obviously, on the left, you can message this as an anti-poverty tool, reductions in income inequality, and being a pro-worker policy. I think on the right for that issue, you can frame it as pro-family. I mean, in version 1.0 of Build Back Better, we had these very complex daycare, subsidized daycare, regulated daycare solutions. This is to the right saying this is a pro-family policy that puts hands in the money of families. If they want to have an informal childcare situation with a relative, or if one parent wants to stay at home, like the cash allows them to do that and make that choice to their family. And so I think that different kind of messaging, at the end of the day, it's those two different messages, while they seem dissimilar, are aimed at the same policy of a refundable, universal, like monthly child tax credit at a higher level. And so I think that's kind of the strategy you need to take if you want to create durable change under divided government.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think, when you're talking about things, it's the audience. And I think as you're talking, the group of individuals who have joined us today, and I think it maybe leads into a couple of questions that I want to get to, is I think the messaging is important. And I think it's also knowing your audience and, what you're bringing to that audience as it relates to what's the compelling argument for that policy. Just to step into a little bit of what I would say is a controversial topic, and I'm interested in all three of your perspective on this. With the decision of the Dobbs case, I believe that it is going to place, I think, some challenge between the relationships between employers and employees and how businesses are operating, and we're already starting to see it in how companies are responding related to their employee base, especially if they're in a state that had, trigger laws. I would be interested in, I'm going to open it up to any three of you to kick this off, but, as we're seeing this impact, where do you see, where do you think it's going as it relates to how employers have to respond to not only just legislative vehicles, but now judicial rulings? And do you see future cases impacting, I think, the relationship between employers and employees? So I will throw it open to whoever wants to jump into that. A little bit of I don't want to say controversy, but I think really practical, like how our business is going to address the current, climate and then the future climate. And don't be shy in raising your hand.
I'm happy to kind of start with, look, I think anyone who's telling you they can predict what's going to happen with employers and a whole lot of things with this decision, I don't have a lot of confidence in any of my predictions on that. Obviously, I think, one thing I'm just going to look at and see is I'm kind of curious about is to see what types of employers are making these decisions. Is it, is it the types of businesses that Ron DeSantis might call the woke left businesses, or whatever it is. But I think more broadly, in terms of future court cases impacting employers, the thing I'm really looking at is just the federal government's ability to regulate in a lot of spheres. Obviously, we saw that with another case, which was kind of centered around the EPA, obviously, but has broader implications. And in that West Virginia case, again, I think a lot of people focused on the environmental impact, but there are broader implications. This is kind of a long-term thing that's been happening in the court on the ability of the government to regulate under the non-delegation doctrine. And I think for activists, organizations who are trying to enact policy, I think they really need to be serious about designing policy with an understanding of where the court is going. So I'd go back to an example that is tax related. The American Rescue Plan had state and local aid and had a condition that states that accepted it could not reduce their tax burden, their tax rates in the 2 years, I think it was, following that. The idea behind this was you're getting a bunch of money, you can't just use it to throw it into tax cuts. And I think, I wrote about this at the time. You kind of have to think about whether that type of a policy, whether it's beneficial or not, whether that's really likely to stand up in the current court that we have. That provision was mostly thrown out by the courts and is now not really being enforced. So I think it changes how we see policy, how specific we might need to get in writing legislation as well, oriented towards what the court will look like and does look like.
I mean, I think Arnab, you and Alec will go to you next. I think that's actually something that's really important for the ecosystem that's existing in policy is understanding, I guess, understanding the influence or understanding how this court is going. And, I think you very sharply articulated that when we're looking at all areas of policy and understanding how things are going to be challenged more, especially I can imagine if there's an angle where I would just use the word, nicely, more conservative activists feel that there's an overstep of the federal government, that how they're going to use the judiciary to peel back or, further, I think, cement more of their viewpoint on policy. That's interesting. Alec.
Yeah, I'd love, first of all, Arnab, I want to make a point about the EPA decision. So you took my point there, and I think we're even now on preempting each other. But just to expand on that point a little bit, I think this is really looking at future Supreme Court cases, seeing how Chevron deference gets narrowed over time is the key thing for the business community. And what that likely will mean is that for the trend for years and years has been kicking more of the responsibility for the specifics of regulation to federal agencies under Chevron deference. And now that can all kind of get kicked back to Congress. And so the business community will have more of an interest and more of a focus on what's going on in Congress, there'll be more pressure applied for things to happen there. I'm not sure whether that means we'll get more legislation or more regulation or different kinds of regulation, because more pressure could be applied to a dysfunctional Congress or a divided Congress and you get no different outcomes, but it will be more of a focus going forward. And then just on the Dobbs decision, I think I also have low confidence, like Arnab, in future predictions here. But I think at least one thing probably we'll see will be increased geographic sorting, both by employers who have strong political preferences and employees as well. So people will be thinking about, like, should I move to this state or that state, given the rights that are allowed there or not allowed there.
Yeah, and I think the challenge that I have is, more from the small business perspective is, how are small employers navigating? I think more, not just the, Dobbs decision, but I think just in general, how even states are addressing a whole host of social issues that ultimately impact their workers. And, in many cases, I think, as Alex's example is, you have your mom and pop stores that aren't necessarily able to pick up and move, and are then, I think, very much stuck with trying to navigate these complex issues in their jurisdiction. Alex, did you have anything to say, or can we move on, or not?
Yeah, I just have, you guys both took my West Virginia versus EPA pivot, but I guess I just have a sort of small angle here. I think this, and broadly changing, I know Chevron, it's not like West Virginia versus EPA overturned Chevron or something, but that if the court is moving more in that direction, saying that, no, you can't do all of this through the, through the executive branch, I think in some ways this strengthens the case for a carbon tax from the perspective of a sort of from a green perspective, where if it is something that is passed, you'd have to pass through Congress, and there are a bunch of sort of other arguments for a carbon tax, but I think that is, if the regulatory, I think a carbon tax would be much better than the existing regulatory approach, but especially from just a pure environmental perspective, setting efficiency aside, if you don't really have the regulatory option anymore, if the court takes a lot of that policy off the table, I think that creates a much more serious case for a carbon tax being your best alternative. And I know that there are a lot of groups, for various reasons, who are skeptical or down on the carbon tax's prospects. But if that's where court decisions go, I think that it may become, I think people might start walking down that path.
I just want to stick on something as it relates to this question of bipartisanship and maybe just the realities of government. I have been very much closely watching the innovation bill, or USICA, or CHIPS bill, and I would be interested in all three of your opinion. Breaking news, I guess, kind of last week with the news that Manchin has been working with Schumer on reconciliation, but I think the bigger issue is McConnell coming forward, the minority leader in the Senate, coming forward and saying, he would block the innovation bill. And really what I think is, a bipartisan effort to address competitiveness within the US economy, if moving forward with reconciliation. And I find, I guess, I really struggle with the fact that here we have an example of, I think, the legislative process working in where, House and Senate have come together. We're actually having a conference. It seems to be going very slowly, but how do we navigate through the fact that, we, in one case, do have, Leader McConnell, ultimately threatening to hold something hostage. And then how do we apply that to anything that could happen at the end of the year, or really going into next year, where we are going to, at a minimum, have a change in one chamber? So I know that's a complicated question, but how do we assess the opportunity for business legislation when we have something that is currently working its way through the process that, has garnered Republican and Democrat support, potentially, being stopped because of the decision by, Senate leadership to move forward with reconciliation? Alec, can I start with you on that?
Yeah, I'd love to. Maybe I'll give the more optimistic take. I try to be the optimist in DC as much as I can. It can be hard sometimes, though. I would say that what we're seeing here is hardball negotiating tactics by McConnell, which is obviously pretty typical for his kind of strategy in Congress. And so I think one, that part of that incentive should go away next cycle in terms of like there won't be, there very likely won't be a Democratic reconciliation bill they'll be trying to hold other legislation hostage to. So that roadblock or like, you know, other chit in the negotiating basket will be gone next cycle. And then, you know, even in the worst case scenario where he says he doesn't want to move forward with he won't let Senate Republicans move forward with the conference process, the underlying USICA Senate bill is a bipartisan bill passed with mostly Democratic votes last year. And so the House always has the option of just passing that bill and then President Biden can sign it into law. So there still exists a bipartisan US competitiveness bill that could become law. I know that House leadership has said they don't want to do that, but I'm just saying it's on the table. And I think you can think of this as a negotiating situation where it was always probably the case that the Senate version would be much heavier weighted in the conference process between the House and the Senate. And we thought there were very important provisions in the House bill, like the green card cap exemption for immigrants with advanced STEM degrees. That would have been huge for the US economy, makes sense in a competitiveness bill, would have made the chips part of the bill more cost effective and the ability to actually re-onshore semiconductor manufacturing. So we're disappointed that is looking like it's not going to make it in the final bill, no matter what happens with conference. But at the end of the day, if we're being realists about it, probably the final version was going to be something very close to the Senate bill, and the House always has the option to pass the Senate bill.
Arnab, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would second pretty much all of that. I think if you're Leader Schumer, you just need to prioritize a little bit here. Like I can't remember exactly what the dollar figure is in USICA, I think around 250. The reconciliation bill would be bigger in all likelihood. And I think they should take Leader McConnell at his word that he won't pass it, but there will be other opportunities for bipartisan consensus in the next Congress. And I would say like McConnell's been pretty good about holding his caucus together, but there are a lot of people who prioritize this really high. And a lot of Republicans are actually, you know, pretty unhappy with how limited USICA, the Senate version, ended up becoming in the end. So it's not like there's no opportunity there, that he's not going to feel any pressure there. So that's kind of where I would put it.
I mean, I would also just say that Senator Manchin just probably handed McConnell a reprieve on things, given he just the news just broke that he's pumping the brakes on reconciliation yet again. But Alex, do you have anything you want to add? So I think more of how does this bode for the future, especially with divided government, where, you know, if the Republicans take the House, I mean, there is a shift in the power dynamics of how things work. And I do think even if, you know, Leader McConnell remains in the minority of his leadership, you know, there's a lot more that has to be more delicately negotiated if we're going to actually advance policy in the business space or in the healthcare space or in the labor place or the family policy space. But Alex, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'd say probably the scale of what could happen is going to be much smaller, but there is currently there is a conflict that between a bipartisan idea or a transpartisan, cross-partisan, however you'd like to define it, and we can use let's say cross-partisan. I think that's pretty fair about USICA. And then you have a partisan agenda, and that they're sort of conflicting for a bunch of from a bunch of people's perspectives. And under divided government, you only have one option for what to do. So that's going to be like smaller in scale, but it's going to be smaller in scale, but I think in some ways maybe more likely.
Yeah. Can I I don't want to say go off script, but I think a little bit of one of the challenges that I think that as you know, the philanthropy space, the funder space is really looking at their plans for 2023. You know, I think Arnab, you kind of started to suss it out. I think the fears of recession are real, and I think in my non-economist perspective, I think that there is a real challenge with, you know, how do we use all the tools in our toolbox? So, you know, we have the Federal Reserve, we do have tax policy, we have legislative mechanisms, we have regulatory mechanisms. How are you thinking about ways in which all of these different levers can be pulled and influenced by players, and I use players quite broadly, to make sure that we aren't necessarily cutting off our nose to spite our face, or whatever analogy we should use. Whereas we have this economy that it's seemingly keeps rolling, even with 9% inflation announced today. But I also feel like as soon as we go into divided government, you are going to see what I would say more traditional Republican policies who are going to, want to tap down federal spending, are going to want to leverage tax policy more aggressively. Like how do all of these things come together to really ensure that businesses and their employees / workers are not the ones who are, in the unemployment line or seeing their wages diminish, and also can maximize the dollars that they do have for their lives. And
so I think there's a couple ways, and we've kind of written about this in the past, about particularly on the inflation challenge of like a holistic anti-inflationary strategy. And I think there's a couple of things, and some of these are areas for bipartisan consensus that we should be focused on. One is, and this would be potentially a lot of spending, but it's certainly open to places where this could be done through tax policy as well, is how can you get more investment to enhance and preserve productive capacity? And so I think in the energy space, there's a lot of places for us to look for investment there that might have bipartisan appeal, particularly on both with oil production, something we've written about a lot lately, where there's some administrative tools you can use, but they could be supplemented by legislation, certainly. And I think longer term, pushing for more domestic production to facilitate a lot of the products investment that we need. So a good example of this is just some of the critical minerals that we need for the energy transition. I think that's the type of place where you could see bipartisan consensus on investments that would enhance and preserve productive capacity. I think there's also there's targeted demand reduction, and I see the two real places for that being healthcare policy and university tuition, where we spend a lot of money. We have a lot of, particularly in healthcare policy and Medicare spending, we have a lot of levers that we can pull administratively to lower prices, lower service costs. So I think that's a worthwhile place to look. And then I think the third bucket we have is competition policies, and particularly in the technology space, telecommunications space. This is something where, for example, like John Cornyn's been a big supporter of like 5G adoption. That's something that would have pretty tremendous anti-inflationary prospects. It's both a reduction in cost, but it could encourage a lot of cost competition from carriers. You saw this with universal data introduction in the past decade. So these are three places where I think you can utilize a lot of different tools, where legislative, you can both have administrative tools that exist and they could be supported legislatively, and some of those areas, subject areas, have at least some bipartisan consensus.
And maybe I'll add just, I think in terms of the timeline being very important here, I do think once we go into divided government, these counter-cyclical fiscal policies and tax policies will be much harder to implement. And if anything, Republicans want to push in the opposite direction. So time is of the essence. I think what gets done in the next 6 months, if Democrats are worried about a recession for the final 2 years of Biden's first term, they should be thinking, what can we do now that will decrease the odds of a recession over the next 2 to 3 years? And I think this is something I'm not optimistic about, but this would be a great time to implement automatic stabilizers that couldn't be repealed under a divided Congress. Probably not going to happen, but it should. And then once the 6 months is over, I think really the ball is in the Federal Reserve's court. And so other policymakers should be thinking about, and I know this is, I'm just reiterating points that Employ America makes all the time, is how can other policymakers make space for the Federal Reserve to make good decisions? And so in 6 months, it'll probably just be a problem for the Federal Reserve to handle. And so in that time, how can other people make that job easier in the handoff that's to come?
Interesting. Good point. Alex?
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to avoid doing like an accidental arbitrary like Larry Summers putting percentages on things, but in some ways I think of the inflation issue as 90% about demand and maybe 10% about supply, or at least how to inflation, you have too much money chasing too few, goods and services or whatnot. And that it's a lot easier to do demand reduction in the short run than it is to just expand the productive capacity of the economy. So, the Federal Reserve takes the lion's share of dealing with that. But I don't think that should then lead us to remain idle on questions of supply. And it's never a bad time to expand the productive capacity of the economy. And I would say, I think there are tax components to that, but I guess echoing something Arnab actually said earlier about research as well, that research doing like, tax just sort of pro-investment, tax cuts or tax reforms on R&D and increasing government support for research and development is not an either or, I think, option. I think all three of us probably agree that that's probably a good idea. I mean, basically returns to R&D are pretty powerful, and social returns to R&D, both public and private, are quite large. And then I think broadly thinking about how we structure the tax code to treat investment equally to consumption and making sure we don't penalize investment. I know I talked earlier about how companies have to spread deductions out over time. That's especially true for structures, especially commercial structures. The cost of investing in a commercial structure, think like a warehouse, like the shell of a factory, not necessarily the equipment inside, but the shell of a factory, office buildings, et cetera, have to be depreciated over 39 years. And when, inflation, you divide, spread out a deduction, and inflation is as high as it is now, that's a huge tax penalty. And so moving towards a system that allows companies to deduct capital investments and capital costs the same way they get to deduct operating costs would get rid of what is essentially a penalty on companies that are more capital intensive. So moving towards a system where capital and operating costs are treated equally, I think that would be a very strong sort of mid-long-term measure about strengthening the US's domestic capacity and a lot of industries that are particularly reliant on big physical capital.
So Alex, you actually kind of hopped into my last question, lightning round, before I turn over to my colleague Lee Gibson and Niskanen to close us out. But for Arnab and Alec, what do you think, or what would you like to see the focus of the new Congress as it relates to business? I would hope that it would maybe be a tax policy issue, since we're talking about tax policy, but where do you actually see the most interest, excitement, desire for Congress to come together and address something that could be incredibly beneficial to businesses and their workers in the next Congress? Alec, you want to go first?
Sure. I'm happy to start. I can't satisfy the wish on tax policy though, because I have to talk about immigration. It's one of our core 3 areas here at the Institute for Progress. And I'm not optimistic about comprehensive immigration reform as much as I would like it to happen. I think we could see the potential for narrower immigration reforms that would benefit businesses and the economy writ large, as we're seeing labor shortages and just trouble finding workers for growing and expanding businesses. And so I think we could see things like H-1B reform. There's been bipartisan support for that in the past, moving away from a lottery system and towards something like a wage ranking, just to make sure that we're prioritizing the most talented and productive individuals immigrating to the US. We have forthcoming analysis on this that's likely to estimate that this could double the GDP impact of the H-1B program if you just made this one simple switch that both sides seem to support. You can also do things like the green card cap exemption for immigrants with advanced STEM degrees. It's not going to happen in USICA conference process, but it could happen. Versions of this could happen in a future defense bill or other legislative vehicle. There's lots of support on both sides because this is likely the most unobjectionable type of immigration. Like, it's hard to be against having people with STEM degrees move to the United States and contribute to our economy. And so I think those narrow reforms could happen next cycle.
I did not think that's where you're going to go, so I'm glad you could keep us on our toes for a whole hour. Arnab, last word before I turn over to Lee.
I think broadly industrial policy, that's something where there's a lot of bipartisan energy. I'm open to where that could happen on tax policy. I'll put in a specific plug for the Industrial Finance Corporation, which we've worked on with Senator Coons's office. A really great bill. I think one of the benefits of that is that would be both very large but very nimble. It has a mix of authorities that could be deployed quite effectively and quickly. And so whether it's for small businesses or large, it could really like tailor the right tool for the right outcome. And so that's something I would love to see some more energy behind. And I think there would be bipartisan support for something like that.
Again, not something I thought was going to come up, but I'm glad that we had a wide-ranging conversation. I think, anything talking about business could be hours long, because I think of the diversity of the business community, which is probably another topic for another webinar. But Lee, I will turn it over to you to close us out. Lee Gibson, for those of you who don't know, who's the Vice President of Social Policy at Niskanen Center. So Lee.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And thanks to the panelists. What a terrific conversation. I've been following these issues more closely ever since I joined Niskanen, and I'm coming away today with both new perspectives and some even increased optimism about things that might be possible together in the years ahead. I can't recommend enough the other 3 prior panels on family policy, employment, and health policy. They brought new voices and new perspectives to issues that many of us thought we knew well, just like today. So I encourage you all to turn your attention to Public-Private Strategies YouTube channel, where they are all posted. In addition, we're looking ahead in later July, I think July 21st, for a possible encore performance with a one-on-one conversation with Katie and a special guest to provide a capstone to these conversations. Finally, I just want to thank Katie and her team at Public-Private Strategies, Michael and Maya, for their help with this, and of course to Danielle at the Rockefeller Foundation. It's been very exciting to work with all of you to both conceptualize this series and then execute it. We all shared a passion for what was ahead after the midterms, and I think we've really helped move the conversation forward, bringing new voices and perspectives to this Rockefeller priority we all share, namely justice for workers. I'm hoping the conversations we've started here today continue and spur collaboration among funders, advocates, and bring together unexpected bedfellows. So thank you all again today for your time and attention.
Thank you all. And I did just drop in the links for the 3 other panels, which we also will include in our wrap up. And I do want to just thank Lee Gibson and Sam Hammond at Niskanen for their great support of this and the great team at Rockefeller. So with that, I hope everyone is having a great week. Appreciate you all joining us this afternoon, and we'll be in touch soon.
Thank you.
Thank
for having
you.
us.